Our next speaker is Dan Scheinman, who comes to us from Cisco Systems, where he's Senior Vice President of Corporate Development. He leads the merger and acquisition, venture investment, strategic alliance, technology incubation, and corporate public relations organizations within Cisco. He holds a political science degree from Brandeis University and graduated from Duke University Law School. He and I were just commiserating about Duke's tragic loss to Carolina on Saturday. But we're both trying to get over this and move on to the conference play. Anyway, he will be here to talk about venture capital in China. Please join me in welcoming Dan Scheinman.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I've finished an arduous weekend of burning anything light blue that I could find in my house to purge the Carolina from my house. I want to thank everyone for being here today, and I want to particularly thank BCI, Berkeley, and Morgan Stanley for sponsoring this. China is really an important and ill-understood topic, and I think that opportunities like this give us all an opportunity to really, in a multidisciplinary way, address important issues and be able to get out discussions that we otherwise can't, particularly as we as a corporation, Morgan Stanley as investors, Berkeley as people who study and have thought leadership around this. It's very important for all of us to be able to talk and be open and direct about things. One of the things about China that's always struck me, my affiliation with China began 20 years ago when I ended up at People's University in Beijing, China as a historical accident, speaking no Chinese, hoping to, I was going to help graduate students in the law department at People's University learn about American law. The problem was that I spoke no Chinese and they generally didn't speak English, which led to a lot of really interesting things. But one of the interesting challenges has been that Western observers have always looked at China through Western eyes, right? Beginning with Marco Polo, Western observers have always seen what they've wanted to see in China. And frequently they haven't been able to see sort of the underlying truth of what's going on. And Western analysis has veered between sort of Chinophile and Chinophobe. China is going to be this huge market that we're going to sell a lot into. China is going to be a huge competitive threat to the U.S. economy. And as always, truth lies somewhere in the middle. It's important for all of us to understand what that truth is, and I appreciate Berkeley and the efforts that Berkeley is making, and I think that we need, as individuals and as a company, to look and find that middle ground and that truth. What I want to do is talk for about 20 minutes and then hopefully take some Q&A and listen to the views in the room and hear how you guys feel about things and hopefully take some questions on what you're seeing. The three things that I want to talk about today, but a lot of which are encapsulated by one story that I was thinking about on the way up. This summer I went back to Beijing, where I had not been to People's University in 20 years. And I went back out to People's University and I wanted to see what it was like. And there were two things that struck me right away. The first was the campus was unrecognizable at Renda. There were new buildings everywhere, and there were modern buildings, and the infrastructure was absolutely incredible. Haidian was unrecognizable. All the trees had been torn down. The Mao was gone. And the university was, had become really a modern university where the Chinese students had access to world-class facilities. And I thought this was really great. The foreign student dormitory still existed and actually was in its original form, which meant the good news was it was no longer the nicest building on campus. The Chinese had invested infrastructure in China, and I thought that was important. But as I was wandering through the foreign student dormitory, I went to go see the cafeteria where I spent so much time. And it was amazing. They had turned it into this glitzy place where there was neon everywhere and colors, and there was a motto that said, "Service is our passion," which was quite opposite from 20 years ago. And when I went back, I noticed something, which was the old kitchen still remained, right? Entirely unreconstructed in this fabulous new glitzy cafeteria. And I thought it spoke a lot about China, which was that aside from the glitz and the modernity, there still is this root of something of the old China, that sits at the foundation. Okay, so I know the elephant in the room for many of us is, today, what do we do in China? Morgan Stanley just gave a really great overview. David gave a great overview of sort of the risks and opportunities that are in China. I at Cisco face the question of, okay, what do we do, right? And do we decide to put our money into China, and what should we do? And I would tell you that The answer to that question is actually very complicated, because I thought that everything that was in David's presentation is true, right? Both the strengths and the downsides of China. And that, I think a lot about, the patron saint of all speakers, Dan Quayle, who once said about, democracy in Eastern Europe. He said that the trend towards democracy in Eastern Europe is irreversible, but that could change. And I feel the same way about the process of wealth creation and market economics in China, right? That trend is irreversible, but there are risks, and that could change. I do believe that the positive and the upside that you've seen is real. And if anything, it's almost understated at how real and fundamental the change is in China. And the amount of hope, optimism, and wealth creation that has occurred is fundamental, and is, quite frankly, one of the most empowering, enabling, and vital acts that the world has seen in a number of years. But there are deep structural issues that underpin all of this that give me pause for concern. And those structural issues, which Morgan Stanley talked about, I'll talk about in detail, involve the banking system and social security system. And those impact the Chinese, I think, in a very fundamental way. And lastly, Cisco has decided, in its wisdom, to pursue a stealth investment policy in China. We are actually one of the largest foreign investors in China, and I will talk about why we've done that and what we've done. We've done it very quietly, but today we've got over $400 million invested in China, and we can talk a little bit about why that is and what we're doing, and the impact that that's had on China, and hopefully, I believe, the impact that that will continue to have on the Chinese economic revolution. So, China actually is clearly moving towards a more open market-based economy. And I think that in and of itself is a fundamental positive trend and is a positive statement for China. The foundation of all of that lies in the incredible investment in the infrastructure that was made over the last 5 to 10 years. If you think about China, particularly in the last 5 years, China has effectively tripled its spending on capital expenditures, going from $400 million to $1.2 billion, and has become the driver of the increase in CapEx globally in the world. That CapEx has gone into both physical and virtual assets. Today in China, a population the size of the United Kingdom gets cell phone service every year, adds on to the cell phone network. Broadband is growing dramatically. The airports, roads, bridges, highways, buildings are clearly and obviously booming. China's share of world exports has nearly doubled in the last 5 years, as China is beginning to see an acceleration of its export-led growth, and all of which is that China's GDP has grown north of 9% for the last 15 years, which is an incredible and remarkable achievement. And if China grows at what it projects to be 8% over the next 9 or so years, it will become one of the 3 largest economies in the world, starting from a base that was so far behind and so impoverished several years ago. And I think not lost on the party and not lost on the state is that most of the growth is actually coming from the private sector. It's no longer being driven by the massive state-owned enterprises. Today in China, the private sector is growing at 5 times the rate of the state-owned enterprises. And what you see is there are remarkable creations of wealth that are occurring fundamentally with companies that the state has very little to do with. Today, 75% of all exports come from private sector companies. 57% of the foreign direct investment goes into private sector companies. And this is a fundamental change in the way that Chinese policymakers have thought about the economy, and represents the entrance of a new dynamic force into China. David talked a lot about the demographics and the demographic advantage that China has. And it's very clear, to sum it up, that China has a huge advantage because it has a young, increasingly educated workforce, which is increasingly entering the workforce in rapid numbers, which gives it the ability to generate 500,000 engineers per year, 4.2 million university graduates. The supply of workers coming into the cities is incredible. And these things give China an enormous sustainable opportunity for a number of years. China also is benefited by the fact that it's running huge trade surpluses and saving surpluses, unlike the United States. China now, one of the things I think that's also little understood about China, which is it behaves in some ways like the U.S. did many years ago. China actually runs, as we know, a huge trade surplus with the U.S. of hundreds of billions of dollars, but is actually running trade deficit with many of its neighbors, showing that it's willing to invest in its neighbors for political purposes and also to help develop and sustain new markets, which I think is very wise. Within the last Within the last several years as well, I think equally important has been, within the private sector, has also been the rise of innovation companies. In the past, we had the situation where, even where there were private sector enterprises, a lot of them were actually state-directed. So you had companies in spaces that China thought, well, it's important for us to be in that space. And China would invest and effectively loan money to the companies. And these companies were sort of quasi-private companies. But today, you're seeing true private companies acting as innovation within new markets. You'll see when you look through Mary Meeker's report on the internet, Mary says that that you see all this internet activity, but there's not a lot of innovation. I actually think that we're beginning to see the elbow in the curve where China could take advantage of all of its mobile capacity and its broadband capacity, and you're seeing new innovative applications actually get developed in China. We invested in a company called Shanda, which does video games, online video games. Shanda was the first company that was able to display massively multiplayer video games. And they had the technology to be able to do that. They also were innovative in that they invented a business model to be able to sell tokens through internet cafes to people to be able to play their games. And we see that being repeated in other sectors throughout China. There's a large amount of investment going on into content for mobile phones, and China most likely will lead the world in terms of content being developed for mobile phones. So no longer is really copying or state-directed driving the Chinese economy, but that we begin to see the true emergence of an innovation economy, and this too could represent the next stage of growth for China. As I said at the outset, though, there is a bear case for China, and I think it's very important that China understand that there is a bear case. Every time I've been at these things where we have China-U.S. conferences, in the last couple of years there's been a trend and a fad towards bashing U.S. politicians, either for the vote on declaring petroleum a strategic asset, or on the protectionism or xenophobia that our politicians sometimes show. But China too has politicians that are also making choices, and not always wise choices. And so we have a situation where China is facing between making short-term decisions and long-term decisions, and they face enormous pressure about whether to make decisions that make sense in the short term or to take short-term pain and long-term gain. Look at the banking system. Today, China's banking system, 50% of the loans are non-performing. Over the last summer, China's opened up the banking system to foreign capital and has taken in about $50 billion in capital in an attempt to recapitalize the banks. But still, when you look at the loan classifications and what the Chinese loans are, of the non-performing loans, China has about $270 billion of loans, 90% of which to state-owned enterprises, which have absolutely no hope of ever being repaid. Right? $270 billion is a magic number because it's about the same number as the trade surplus with the United States. Right? McKinsey did a survey and said if China wants to grow by 9%, given that 80% of source of capital in China is still debt, how much capacity does the banking system have to be able to continue to lend to support that growth? And what McKinsey found was that there was a 9% gap in terms of what the banking system needed to lend and what China needed to be able to do to be able to continue its 9% growth. This is fundamental, and merely allowing for foreign investment into the banking system isn't going to fix the fundamental problems that exist with a system that really wasn't set up to be a true banking system to begin with. The second thing that hangs over China is the looming social security problem. The demographics of China cut both ways. David pointed out very well the population situation, the 1.3 billion people, and the advantages of having a large population. But the challenge for China is that life expectancy has gone from 40 to 60. There is no national social security system, and today only 25% of the people are covered by social security. Many of you may know Gao Shiqing, who's actually a Duke graduate as well, who now is running the social security system for his sins and having to make up for this mess. And Gao says, that the only way to fill the gap, the $100 billion gap to get to what they need today is to be able to deal with the asset that the Chinese have in the state-owned enterprises. But the Hobson's choice is that if they were to sell off the state-owned enterprises, they would lead to a situation where, it would further perpetuate the problem because you'd have to have more unemployment, more people slim down, more efficiency. In the Social Security system today, today you have 3 workers for every retiree in China. That situation is going to change because of the one-child policy, where you will go quickly to 1-to-1 by 2020. You're going to be in a situation where the expectations of the Chinese people are going to rise as wealth is created in the countryside. And no longer are people going to want to live on 15 yuan a day or less. And the ability to provide for retirees is going to be fundamental. And China is going to have to make hard choices in order to be able to fund a safety net for its people. All of which says that there is risk that is in the China equation, and there is significant risk that's built into the China equation. When I talk to entrepreneurs in China, frequently the line I hear all the time is, yeah, that's all in the state-owned enterprise sector. That's all. It doesn't impact us at all. But the truth is that the state still plays such a large role, and because of the inherent market socialist economy that exists in China, and because of the tension between government involvement and laissez-faire, the government continues to play, either as a consumer, a regulator, or as an influencer of markets, a huge role. And that if the state-owned enterprises, and if the banking sector, and if the social security sector has problems, those problems doubtlessly will flow into the innovation economy and will impact entrepreneurs as well. I also believe that China's leaders recognize the problem, and they see and they are struggling with the dilemma of what to do. They recognize and they see that the export-led model has gotten them so far and gotten them to a certain point. They see that that they face these challenges in terms of providing jobs and opportunity for the population, and they have made a decision that the way forward is actually no longer just to mimic the West, but to actually innovate, and that they have faith and belief that the innovation economy will generate jobs and opportunity within China. And I think ultimately our job in the West is to help sustain and support those people in China who think that way. And if we can do that, we can fundamentally change the calculus and the relationship between China and the West. We can create more Silicon Valleys, more consumers of gigabits and MIPS and things, which is actually a good thing for all of us, right? And we create new markets, new opportunity on both sides for products and services, and we further create that sense of neighborness and intertwined that both countries need and will help move us forward. Let me close before taking questions by talking about what Cisco is doing in China and how we're dealing with some of the dilemmas that exist in China. When we looked at this many years ago, we saw foreign companies had a lot of bad choices, right? You had basically the Chinese government said, we want you to come and invest and either set up a JV or put a lot of money into China. And in general, the companies that did that, particularly in areas that were viewed as strategic to the state, ended up in a situation where they either lost they lost market share to local competitors, or found the local competitors cycle time to catching up with them was very quick. So we made a strategic decision many years ago that we were not going to do a joint venture or sink a lot of resources in, but instead we were going to try and do something different, which was to invest very heavily in the innovation economy. Today, directly and indirectly, Cisco has over $400 million deployed in China, and we have actually generated returns out of that portfolio. Our largest investment is in a venture fund called SAFE, the SoftBank Asia Infrastructure Fund. We started out as 100% of the capital in that fund. And today, in round two, we're actually less, but we're still one of the major investors in it. We also have direct investments. We've invested in a number of companies directly in China and have been, been active in trying to find companies. There are two places we look. One is on services. So we look at what's on top of the network and see if we can find innovative new products and services like Shanda and others that we're investing in. We also look at components, where China has a fundamental competitive advantage using its low labor costs to be able to innovate. And we have a huge portfolio invested in China. Additionally, we've been very aggressive about putting manufacturing into China. Over the last 5 years, we've increased China's share of manufacturing. Cisco's manufacturing has increased by 10 points. We have now, on any given day, as many as 100,000 Chinese workers manufacturing in the supply chain for Cisco, manufacturing products. We also recently have begun to put engineering in China in a very targeted, focused way. And we have an investment center in Shanghai, which has about 150 engineers working on real product development, as opposed to doing just R&D or things that are for show. And the product development is around our voice products, and that has been a significant investment. And lastly, Cisco has had a sales presence in China for a number of years. We face incredible domestic state-sponsored competition, and for us, we have to find ways to continue to innovate and move aggressively ahead of those who are state-sponsored and have certain built-in advantages in terms of selling and dealing with China. And we believe that through continued investment in innovation, that through continued partnership with local entrepreneurs, and that continuing our pace and speed and bringing together our advantages, our core competitive advantages, we can out-innovate and outpace the local competitors and hopefully regain some of the market share that we've lost over the last several years. So anyway, I'm very optimistic about China. I'd love to take questions in the room if I have a couple minutes left, just to hear what's on your mind and see if there's anything out there that you guys see that is different, or if anything I said may generate any views. Thanks. Stan.
I'm curious, compared to when you first became involved in China and now, do you find the legal environment different in any way? Is there greater certainty, the same amount of certainty, different problems, new problems?
So the question involves the legal environment, and from 20 years ago. Well, certainly there has been enormous difference 20 years ago. Today, I think we are more confident that we can enter the Chinese legal system and receive a result which accords with the underlying facts of the case. It's very clear that counterfeiting is becoming less and less tolerated. 5 or 10 years ago, there were villages that were set up to make Cisco-like products, and governments, particularly in the South, have gotten more aggressive about shutting those things down as China has become more active in the world economy. I still would say we have a long way to go, and I think one of the things that would be great for Berkeley and other institutions to do is to train Chinese judges. I think if we could spend the amount of energy training Chinese judges in what IP is and in the importance of IP, as China builds its IP portfolio, I think these judges can be at the forefront of creating a regime that's more equitable, fair, and becomes more predictable for everyone.
Somewhat related to the last topic, specifically, it seems like in general, if you're going into China to do business, you want to make sure you stay on the good side of Chinese authorities. It might be seen that your specific action with Huawei was counter to that. I'm curious about the thought process that went into that, and whether you think that does help or hinder Cisco and other companies as they move forward.
Yes. So our legal action against Huawei, I think we faced a situation where we had to act in order to protect the IP. So at the end of the day, we spent hours debating this point, and you reach a point where you have to make a decision one way or another around the IP, and that became sort of a touchstone point for us where we said we have to act. Clearly, Huawei has gained share in China since the action, and I think that you could make the argument that within China there was an issue that was generated, and we did touch upon some of the nationalism. But I would say on the other side, at the end of the day, the way that we're going to compete with Huawei anyway is to out-innovate Huawei. We have the broadest, deepest platform in our space, and as long as we can keep innovating, there's no way that Huawei is able, it doesn't have the customer base we have, and it doesn't have the ability to to acquire, it doesn't have any capital to get new technologies. And so as long as we can get Huawei to play on our rules and in our game, even in China, the customers are going to want the things that we deliver and bring to the table and the innovation we bring to the table. And I would say that, what we've seen in the last couple of quarters is actually a highly encouraging sign for us in China, where we've seen, as China has again said, okay, we're going to be investing in all this new 3G infrastructure, and we're going to be building out our network. We've seen that increasingly China has again turned to us looking for innovation and the kind of things that our products bring. So I think it's actually good for everyone. We're going to compete hard with Huawei. It's going to be a fun battle. It's going to be an interesting time for them and for us. I think because they cannot access capital markets because of their debt situation, which in a lot of ways I think mirrors China, it puts them in an odd position. And I think that gives us core competitive advantage moving forward. Okay, I think I've used up my time. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.